I'm Venetia Porter. I'm a curator here at the British Museum. I'm responsible for the collections of Islamic and contemporary Middle Eastern art. So we're standing now in the Al-Bukhari Foundation Gallery of the Islamic World, which we opened in 2018. And one of the wonderful things about this gallery is that in addition to being able to show our treasures of Islamic art, we also are able to show contemporary Middle Eastern art. So the intervention that we have in the gallery at the moment is an extraordinary collaboration with the writer Hisham Matar and the photographer Jaballa Matar. And this whole project, where essentially they have curated two sides of this showcase here in this really quite groundbreaking exhibition. Essentially, this project started with an acquisition, and it was an acquisition for the collection of this photo book called Evidence by Jaballa Matar. And what this book is opening a window onto an extraordinary story. It's the story of the disappearance of Hisham Matar's father, Jaballa Matar, who was disappeared by the Qaddafi regime. And this is a subject about which he's written extensively. And Jaballa Matar has created this photo book which echoes this story. So one of the extraordinary parts of this is really thinking about what Hisham was going to put on his side of the case, and for him really to be choosing these objects. And then, in a sense, what he's created is the case is an object in itself, because he chose those particular heads, a broken wing, a face, and really interspersed them then with these objects that were his own, these photographs, his father's identity card. And for a writer, I think this was initially quite a challenge, because he hasn't worked with objects before. But what was extraordinary about it was that the more he looked at these objects, the more they resonated for him, and that they took on a role of their own for him. So the interesting thing is also the positioning of this case, because the story is also about the many thousands of people who disappeared during the Qaddafi era, and it mirrors what we see on the end wall here, all these faces of martyrs, essentially, of the Lebanese civil war. The civil war which began in 1975 and carried on until 1990. So the conversation that we're now going to hear is between Hisham Matar, Jaballa Matar and Hartwig Fischer, chaired by Philippe Sands, and they're going to explore what doing this display has meant, and about the story, of course, that this is all based on.
Hello, I'm Philippe Sands. I teach international law at the University of London. I do cases before international courts of tribunals, which include a whole raft of issues, very international, and issues of evidence and photography and words and ideas are very much part of my daily life. And it's fabulous to find myself here at the British Museum with three people whose company I value enormously. To my left, Hisham Matar, my friend, a writer, trained as an architect, originally from Libya, but now dividing his time between Britain and the United States. To my right, Jaballa Matar, a photographer, and originally from the United States, also dividing her time between Britain and the United States. And both Hisham and Jaballa, who have a certain connection, spend time in other parts of the world also. And finally, Hartwig Fischer, the director of the British Museum. We're in your institution, Hartwig, and thank you so much for inviting us and for allowing us to be here. And the reason we're here is to talk about an installation which has been given the title An Intervention. We can maybe come back to that, which has been put together by Hisham and Jaballa, by Jaballa and Hisham, and which reflects their working lives and their activities. Jaballa's book, both photography and words, Evidence, and Hisham's non-fiction work, The Return.
Philippe, you said to me, you have to read this book. And it was The Return. So I did read the book, of course. And it's a very, very important experience for me, reading this book. Now, as you know, I'm very much into books. So reading for me has always been a way of engaging with the world, exploring the world, understanding the world, and most of all, being with people. And reading The Return, which starts at the airport, and there's a third person, who's your mother, makes you understand that this is a book that has many, many layers. It's very much also a book about your family, Hisham, I felt. And what you give us as readers is really an understanding of that family. And by the way, I've never read it as a so-called non-fictional work. Nor have I read it as a fiction. I've read it as a book. And you know, to understand who this man, your father, was for you, for your mother, for your brother, that is very important in the book. It's not only about the political activity and the disappearance and the conflict and the horror of the not knowing until the day the letter arrives that your father managed to smuggle out of the prison. And then it's one of the most terrible passages in the book, those conversations with Qaddafi's son and the continued not knowing and the continued not revealing, not sharing, not telling. That, I think, if you want to get a sense of the brutality of the regime, it is very much in that kind of behavior too. The constant threat which underpins all this. There's this moment in the garden, somewhere in this crazy time of COVID, when Natalia comes down and gives me evidence. Not the book you would find in the bookshop, but the artist book. And I sat there and opened the book and didn't know what to expect. And it just completely blew my mind. You know, I'm also a person who relates to visual work. And just going through the book and looking at how you, Diane, have created a work. And I think that's also something that intrigues me, that there is all this magma of experience, of engagement, of pain, of absence. And then there is this transposition into something that has a shape and that is thought through, that is a composition, if you like. So I turned page after page and I thought, this is an extraordinary work. It's a work of art. The way the image is set in a very distinct way on the pages, often, you know, pushed towards the margins, a lot of white, a lot of silence, here and there a word, a phrase, an entry, which seemed to be a way to communicate to you very directly what you were looking at and what you were not able to look at. And I think that's the ambivalence of the word evidence, because obviously looking at it, you know, you try to glean and gather that evidence. But in doing so, you yourself, as a photographer, do not only ask yourself, and that's one of the entries in your sketchbooks, you know, how much evidence does a photograph hold? If you go to a place, if you look at a place, and if you transform that place into an image, how much can we read of what has happened there? So the book gives you the evidence, but it gives you also the evidence of the ambiguity of evidence, the unfathomable depth of not knowing. as you try to get a grip on this. And at the same time, it is a very beautiful object. And that's yet another pretty uncanny aspect of all this. You know, you're producing, shall I call it, works of art? And what is that? You know, what does that space of art allow you to say that you couldn't say otherwise? And that for me is an absolutely crucial question.
It hugely opens the imagination, this book.
I mean, that's why I think the title means different things. You know, it's literally the return back to Libya, but it's also the return of things that were on the edge of oblivion for me, memories, my father possibly, the return of those things back to me, or the possibility of the return. But it's also a return in a slightly subtler way, in the sense that part of that experience of, you know, having your father disappear, knowing, you know, friends who have been imprisoned, and all of what comes with political oppression and exile, you do feel as if you're drowning. And I wanted to create a state of emergence in the book. I think of the book partly as that, as things emerging, coming up to the surface. The loud moments and the quiet moments, you know. Because also with all of that going on, doing the things that are important, such as looking at a painting, become complicated, you know. So how do you create a space where you can talk about and address, you know, these very, very loud moments, such as the various political violence that happens, but also what it's like to continue to be a human being through it all, and think about the world and art and ideas.
You went with your camera.
Yes.
And did you know, I asked Hisham whether he knew when he was going, whether he was going to write about the experience. Did you know what the product might be of your arrival in this new place with a camera?
Well, I had been working for several years before going to Libya on work about disappearance, and mainly about Hisham's father, and this idea of what can you say in an image. You know, photography is reliant on a subject, it's reliant on something in front of us to see. And what can you say with a camera, the photograph, when you can't see that subject? It was very much about the disappearance of Jaballa, Hisham's father. When we went to Libya, what I very quickly realized was this affected many, many, many people and many families. And I started looking at it as a larger societal issue, and looking at the places where many people had been disappeared and imprisoned.
As a photographer, a working photographer, go into that environment with an open mind, or you have a sense of what it is that you're looking for? I'm focusing now on the product. There's Hisham's book, The Return. There's your published work, Evidence. Tell us a little bit about the production of Evidence.
No, I didn't go in with the idea of what Evidence eventually became, by any means. I mean, as you can imagine, that trip was, first and foremost, very personal. And I'm a photographer, it's my way of being in the world. I was photographing everything. But I did have a very keen sense of wanting to photograph these sites where these atrocities had happened. And I approached them in a way that I had thought about a lot, and we can talk about that later. But to answer your question, the work I made in Libya, and then I made more work in Italy about Libyan dissidents that had been killed. And at the time, those were kind of three separate projects. It wasn't until later, coming back and doing the subsequent work in Rome, and doing more research and getting archival material and putting it together that I came up with evidence. So it was, part of it is very, I think, subconscious and just reaction as a photographer, and then part of it was very methodic.
To what extent did you have an inner struggle in deciding how much of the presentation of the book would also follow a narrative arc in which Jaballa becomes a very central character and Jaballa's son becomes an important character? And to what extent, it's sort of a question for both of you, was there an interplay between you as you were going through this process in Libya in exploring the ideas that would emerge, you with your pen, you with your camera and your pen? How much is there an interaction between the two of you, or to what extent are you going off separately and not interacting in an intellectual way? You're obviously interacting in an emotional way deeply, but it was a journey you took together. Maybe first Diana and then Hisham.
Yeah, it was a journey we definitely took together. I mean, like I said, I had started this work quite a few years before we went to Libya. So I was, going to Libya was an extension of that. And the narrative, I'll answer the first part of your question first. The narrative that I brought through the book, it was actually late in the day that I decided to put that narrative through. And what it was really is just going back through my diaries. And it was when I started looking at those diaries, realizing that this was the best way to situate these images, that is the way I would link them together.
I watched Diana approach this subject before we went to Libya. And she produced a small pamphlet of some photographs and some of the writings from her diary about my father. And it was such an interesting thing. Before you went? Yeah, before we went. It was a very interesting thing to observe because she was approaching the subject that has overwhelmed me for a very long time. And exactly because it overwhelms me, I don't know how to talk about it, and I don't know how to certainly don't know how to make work about it. And I'm not interested as a writer to make a photocopy of an experience, to document a particular experience. That has its place. It's just not how I work. And so I wanted to find a way into this thing that has dominated me. And one of the ways that I get at least closer to figuring out how to write a book, I do feel a kind of authority over it. And this is a subject that I didn't feel any authority over. So observing Diana find this way into it, from her perspective, she's never met my father. So I was also surprised that he was real for her, even though she has never met him. He was somebody that she could have a very direct, profound, private conversation with through images and words.
Have an impact on the way in which you wrote The Return or dealt with certain subjects in The Return? I'm trying to explore...
Yes, it had an impact on the attitude of my approach. Because I thought, yes, I see now, one of the things that I'm enlivened by, of course, and which is part of the cause of being dominated by the subject, is all the things I don't know. The things that I've spent, a quarter of a century trying to find out. How, who kidnapped my father? Where was he taken? What were those moments like? When he was flown home, what did he think about? Was he blindfolded? Did they take the blindfold off at some point? What did he see? So the account is filled with black holes and those black holes get more and more profound and more unbearable to think about, right? But I found that there was a very strange contradiction going on. That the man didn't want to go to the black holes. Of course, I mean, who would want to think about such things? I don't. But the writer was enlivened, his imagination enlivened and invigorated by these spaces. And I found that the more I approached them with a kind of sort of tender ferocity, and patience and curiosity, that they flowered.
So this brings us now to about 2017, 2018. Evidence is out, the return is out, and enter Hartwig.
The very moment, Diana, that you could again show work to the public, I went to see your exhibition
Because of COVID.
in
Yes.
Kensington.
Yes.
And that was a series of photographs that you have been invited to work on at the National Museum of Archaeology in Naples. And those were portrait heads from Naples and the environs from the Roman period. Striking images. All the heads, in one way or the other, impaired. Something had happened to them. They carried the mark of time. The nose was missing, an eye was gone, a part of their hair itching, chipped off. So you were reading the working of time, the permanence of evidence and the disappearance. That incredible transformation, the sea change into something rich and strange that time does on things, on us. So that was the context. And when I sat in the garden and looked at your book, that was the moment when Venetia, my colleague here at the British Museum, who over 10 years has created an extraordinary, among all the other things that she's achieved in the museum, the extraordinary collection of modern and contemporary art from the Middle East and Northern Africa. And the moment we were able to reopen the museum, that was the show that we put on. Reflections, it was called. A choice of 100 works. We went together to see it. Spanning all, from Iran all the way to the Levant and then all across Northern Africa. And I said to Venetia, look, I've seen this book. We have to have the book in the collection of the British Museum. It belongs here. So you put us in touch. I needed to know, is there still a copy, because it's only an edition of 10. Venetia saw it and of course instantly said, yeah, that's a really good work. And managed to acquire it for the museum. And I'm extremely happy about that. I think it's wonderful the book is here.
Perhaps the three of you here could reflect on this. The going about of identifying items held in the collection of the British Museum here in London that could in some way inform, accentuate, reflect, distinguish what you decided you wanted to put in your two respective exhibits. Explain a little bit how you went about that act of choosing items, why you chose what you chose.
I mean, to state the obvious, this isn't usually what I do. So to be invited into a museum, it was such a wonderful provocation and a very generous one. What I wanted to do is I wanted to create an object. And how do I do that? How do I...
The object is the whole of
the whole thing. I wanted it to be as an object. And I wasn't really sure what that meant. And so I opened up my own archive, box of things that I've been keeping that relate to the return. Of course, the manuscripts, but also some sketches that I'd made of certain paragraphs or very early on when I was thinking of the shape of the book and I kept doing these circles and some of these, one of those is here.
And squares.
And squares, well, those were for the paragraphs, sort of architectural little drawings that think of what a paragraph can be. This is the endless question. What different time frames it could hold, how it could be explicitly about one particular subject, but can introduce another subject that is cantilevered off it and then maybe addressed later. Things like that. So, but then I also wanted in the main to look at the invitation of Venetia and Hartwig to look at the collection of objects from Libya, of which there are thousands. The British Museum has, and so I found myself getting more attracted by the ones that were from a particular region in Libya, where my family's from. Well, it's the region where my mother's family is from, which is the Green Mountain in Cyrenaica, so northeastern Libya. And there's a place there, a ruin, Apollonia in Arabic, called Shahat, that I've spent a lot of time
including with your father
as a child. So, to me, it's a very, very happy, magical place, up high on the plateau, verdant, with these beautiful Roman ruins and an amphitheater, and you look down at the sea. And so it was one of the places I really wanted to take Diana to, and we went there. And we spent a lovely day there. And most of these objects come from places that are close to that. The other thing that I found very haunting is that objects that were small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, as it were, but also objects that were damaged or fragments, an arm, a part of a figure that seems to be protruding through the clothes, the actual figure. Very, very, things that I responded to very powerfully, and then collected lots of those, and started to think of how I might put them into a conversation with each other. But I also think of these objects as rooted in some way, not only because they were either found in the earth, or because they were made. One of the things that I love about them is that they're quite modest objects. They're all mostly terracotta, almost all of them, apart from one. And they're made, for people to keep at home, pray to, and so on. And they're not, most of them we don't know, who are they meant to, what gods they're meant to represent. But they're also rooted in some sentimental sense for me, if I have to say, really. They really do. It was quite magical to come in here on the day of the installation and have these wonderful people who know everything about these objects helped me put on gloves. Then you hold this object, and apart from the temporal, vertiginous distance between this moment and when the object was made, there's also another complicated distance, that it comes from this very known, familiar place that I have a very, very powerful affection towards. And to encounter it here, where we are both far away from home, and I am trying to arrange them in some way to imply a return.
How much trouble did you face, Diana, in deciding what to put in terms of the objects? You've chosen coins. I'm looking at them right now. We were looking at them closely together before. A set of coins with a human head and a set of coins with horses. What were the alternative options you faced, and why did you ultimately settle on coins? The two of you chose different objects. You settled on different objects.
Yes. I wasn't interested in the coins because they were coins. Right. I was interested in the coins for two reasons. One, visually. The heads I was very interested in because in Libya, many of the disappeared men and boys, so many young boys, They were plastered all over town and in town halls, but also along the roadsides and posters, just kind of headshots of these boys. And I took, and men, and I took a lot of photographs of those. And you know, the French philosopher Levinas, he talks about how the face and the head is our way of seeing God in the other. You know, that's where it lies. It's in the face. And I chose in my book, I only have, I have one photograph of a face that's faded out, yeah, and one face of one of these posters. And it's the only faces I have because this idea of disappearance and not being able to see. And there, I found this link with these coins with these heads on them of gods and rulers, and kind of the weight of that, you know, the head being, it's not just the place that we see each other. It can also be a symbol of oppression and of dictatorship. And so I was more interested in the reason why they were minted, because they were minted by, or at that point they weren't minted, they were struck. The reason why they were struck was because of these troops in rebellion against a colonial power, and what was on them. So that was my choice.
How much exchange was there between you and Diana in the work and ideas you put into the preparation of your respective displays?
Almost
or were you
none.
completely separate?
Almost none. And I think maybe, I don't know, maybe also, I don't know, I mean, I'm now analyzing us. I mean, it wasn't a conscious thought, but maybe it was also a bit of an experiment, like let's see what each one of us comes up with, you know.
I think that it was that, and I think that we also were under a lot of time constraints, and, you know, looking at the images here and what could be brought into it. It's such an exciting thing to do this, because I think I mean, I don't know about writers, but with artists, if you are working with a museum, usually you are invited in to look at the collection and then go out and make a work based on that collection. Where what you have asked and allowed us to do so generously is to bring in our own work and then see, how does our work fit in this long history of what we call art and objects? And I mean, we are sitting between things that are centuries old and new works by these wonderful Lebanese artists, Khalil and Joanna, and there are links between Hisham's intervention and my intervention and these works, and they repeat themselves visually, and they repeat themselves in ways of subject matter and ethos. And I mean, when I was choosing for this work, I was thinking about one, I knew that my book was going to be open to one page, and that's not much to give people. And so I wanted to, out of hoping to be a bit generous, kind of let them in on, well, what are the decisions I was making when I made these works? How was I photographing? What was I thinking about? What was I reading? What were the things that I left out and left in? And then to look at some of the objects in the British Museum that were really, how do I say this? I mean, I was really interested, for example, in the links between colonialism and dictatorship. And I met with the director of the coins collection here, or the keeper of the coins, excuse me, I used the wrong word. And she showed me these works of these coins that were minted by Libyan rebels who were rebelling against Carthage, the occupying power in Libya. And they had horses on them. And the very photograph that I had in my book about kind of linking colonialism to dictatorship in my book were Libyan resistance fighters on horseback riding against Mussolini's troops. And so there were these direct visual links, and you are placed in this long, long line of history. When you think about art and artifacts as being representations of what we go through, you know, what we go through politically, what we go through in our lives, and the circle of those things, of history, how it circles back, and there are always artifacts made. You know, this is, I think, really, it's very moving, I think.
You've also included sketchbooks that I think were produced after your visit to Libya, ways of exploring ideas of what you might include, what you might not include, the style of the images that you would put in the book. There's one scrapbook that contains, I think, the only photograph of Jaballa.
Yeah.
And it's very indistinct, and I found myself first peering at the heads on the coins and then looking through, it's on a sort of circle of faces, looking for Jaballa, peering in. I was going through exactly the same exercise in relation to the coin and the image that you took. But they were centuries apart, and yet essentially connected to the same act of trying to work out who is this person, why is this person portrayed, and what happened to this person.
Yeah, and I didn't want to put a photograph of, it's the only photograph of Jaballa in there, and it's purposely faded out. And that was a way, I guess, of visually looking at disappearance. You can't ever grasp, you don't know what's happened, you can't find information, you don't know. And I think it was really important that I felt that he wasn't seen in the book. And you can't make him out. I can point him to you, but you can't make him out.
Carefully.
So I used this as an opportunity to go back into my archive and look at what went into making the book, what I was thinking about when I was making the book, and look at my, I looked at all my sketchbooks and notebooks from when I was in Libya and from when I got back, and I this is how I make work. I write about what I'm reading and philosophical ideas. I cut up little proof sheets and put them together and make comments, and so I used this opportunity to go into my archive and see, well, what is there? And there was actually much more than I thought, and I had thought much more about what I was doing at the time than I thought I was thinking about it. I thought it was all subconscious, but there's actually notes in these books that talk about why I placed images to the side of the page and why I left white space and why I pulled out the saturation of images. There's notes in them about how I photographed and why I photographed at night and not in the daytime, because I didn't want celestial light. I didn't want natural light. I wanted light from mankind because of passing cars and street lamps, because it was the regime that caused the atrocities. People didn't die. They weren't disappeared by natural causes. It was through decision making and the regime, and using these long exposures, which I write about, allow a kind of information into the images that I was hoping would bring up issues of justice and bring up issues of injustice. And all that kind of thing I had kind of forgotten about until I saw my notebooks. And I just thought it was, since you can't open the book and read it and look at it and and the book is so tightly designed. I wanted to just kind of be free in this, because it's not what you usually get to do as an artist. You think very carefully of how things are. So
now, there is an interesting disconnect between the presentation of what's in the cabinet and the presentation of the book.
yeah,
And that's
Yeah.
fascinating. Hartwig, a closing word for you. You come in at some point and you see these two display cabinets. What do you feel?
In general, when we ask artists to come in and do show work, but also engage with the collection, with objects in the museum, it is, on the one hand, to give them an additional means to highlight what matters to them. But on the other, it's also a desire to open up new dimensions to the objects in the collection, because you can only get to the sense of the possible meaning or meanings of these objects when you engage with them. I've seen these both showcases quite a number of times, and I've spent time in front of them. And I just keep on reading. I just keep on discovering. I just simply keep on seeing things which I hadn't seen. And looking at your showcase, your presentation, your intervention, Diana, there is one note on one of the pages, and I thought you would go there, but you did not, and I'm sure you had your reasons for that. Will I do justice to these boys and men? I read those who've been killed, have disappeared, and have been tortured, and whose freedom was taken away from them. So there is a very strong ethical dimension to that whole work. You produce images, you produce work, you show it. Will I do justice to these people? That's the engagement. Let's say you read the case from left to right, which is not necessary, it's not imposed, but there's a natural tendency here to do it. There is a smaller notebook opened, and on that double spread page there's one entry, we know nothing. Next to it is an image, a photocopy, a rough image of birds in the sky, flying off in different directions. And I think of those birds in Rome in the evening above Termini, that do these incredible constellations in the sky that keep changing all along. But I would like to go to the other side and look at Hisham's showcase. I said, what is it that when an artist comes in and comes with her work or his work and then engages with the objects, that happens here? You notice in the showcase that there is an image of Hisham as a 19-year-old young man. And you learn that this is an image a friend took very close to the moment you learned about the kidnapping of your father. And you have these eyes looking out at you, traumatized, asking, incredibly alert, and suffering. And you've used that image, Hisham, and you've zoomed in onto the eyes or sometimes onto one eye. And that's something you find placed in that overall architecture or layout of the showcase, next to objects, these terracotta objects, which are all fragments. And suddenly you have the bridge between you and your experience and that object in its fragmented state, and it starts to talk to you, and it starts to look at you. You see the eye of the, there's a terracotta head and there's only one eye left, the other part is gone. And it looks out at you. And it asks you questions. And I think this happens here, and it only happens here. It's unique, and it was way beyond what I could have hoped for, but it was all that I had desired to experience by inviting you to come to the British Museum.